Our historical context for this text is European colonialism in the mid-20th century. So I'm going to paint with a really broad brush, and so the picture's not going to be completely fair, but here it is. The age of exploration that starts with Columbus is also the age of European power projected all over the New World and into Africa and the Middle East. European colonial holdings reached their peak sometime in the 1800s. By the mid-20th century, many colonies had gained independence in one way or another. If we zoom in on French Algeria in the early 1950s, we see a time of bubbling conflict before open war, and that's the moment of our story. So there's a map here, and this isn't the greatest reproduction of it, but this shows you, this is Algeria, and the darker areas are the areas that France was most interested in controlling, basically. They really weren't that interested in the interior of the country. It was really this area up here, closest to Algiers, closest to the coast, that they were most interested in being in control of. And so I imagine that our story with Daru is taking place somewhere along this mountain range, right on the border of where France sort of has its greatest influence. So Algeria, we're talking about, just to be clear, this is North Africa. Spain is here. Morocco is here. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. Just to give you make sure you know where we are. Libya is here. Okay. So, of course, colonialism creates conflicts that are more complex than just mother country versus colony. And though that alone is already complex enough, but there's always more to it than that, and I'm going to try to tell you about what the more to it is here. In the case of Algeria, there were many people who had emigrated from France to Algeria, started in the 1830s. So remember I said Camus' father's family had been there 4 generations when he was born. That's because France had taken Algiers, the capital city, and had claimed some part of the territory as its own. And this is just a quick aside. The conflict between these two countries is sometimes said to have started because the man in charge of Algiers hit the French consul with a fly swatter in 1827. That may not be the whole story, but it's pretty cool. Anyway, it's not even quite right to say that the French who came to Algeria migrated, because Algeria was made part of France in 1848. It's called a Department of France. So they were really citizens of both places. In spite of that, the Europeans who lived there were called colons, while the Arabs were called Arabs, Muslims, or indigenous. So language was already working against the official government policy. Now let's think a minute for where this puts the various parties. We have the French, in France, who have conquered some territory and added to their state. They're happy. They make Algerian labor an integral part of their economy through World War I and beyond. The natives of Algeria now have access to France, which is good in that the Algerian men who went to France and worked sent remittances back home, but it's bad because no one wants to be oppressed by a bunch of strangers who speak a different language and practice a different religion. The French who moved to Algeria, the so-called pied noir, that means black feet, and there's different ideas about where that comes from, but it's the name for Europeans who had settled in Algeria in particular. So the pied noir, they're really caught in the middle as the colonial conflict heats up. They had no particular allegiance to France. 28% of them had never even been there. They didn't feel particularly Algerian. They're not Muslim or Arab, so they don't really belong to the culture there. People living in France didn't really see the pied noir as fully French either. They were caught between political identities, and this kind of identity, the person from the colonial power who goes out to the colonies and sort of becomes this in-between person, this happens all over the place, wherever there's European colonialism. So this is what they call them here, the pied noir. I think this is precisely the position in which we find Daru in this story. He is an exile, maybe even in a universal sense. He has no home. Look at his isolation and loneliness. Look at the landscape covered in snow. It's a blank. He's a man that lacks identity. As you read, think about how his action or non-action plays out against this growing colonial conflict. What happens when a person tries not to take sides in a conflict where doing so seems pointless?